Saturday mornings were always my escape, a chance to ditch the drab insurance forms, claims, and endless phone calls that came with being a 31-year-old insurance agent. On weekends, I loved wandering through other people's cast-offs. Something about rummaging for hidden treasures felt therapeutic. That particular Saturday, I followed a series of mismatched signs to a small but tidy brick house at the edge of town. The handwritten sign taped to the mailbox read, "Garage sale, everything must go." There was a single folding table set up near the garage, a few wooden crates on the ground, and a cluster of paintings leaning against the wall. Usually I went straight for tools or vintage electronics, but the paintings caught my eye. Most were forgettable landscapes, but one of them stood out, a narrow wooden frame that held a dark, brooding painting. It depicted a single figure standing in a barren field under a bruised, stormy sky. The figure was hunched, almost lost in shadow, yet I couldn't look away. I asked the woman running the sale, a weary-eyed person in her 70s, how much she wanted for it. She hesitated before answering. $5. $5 for an original painting? Even if it was a no-name artist, it was a steal. "Deal," I said, handing over the cash. As I loaded it into my trunk, the woman approached me, her voice low. "You might not want to keep that one," she said. I forced a polite smile. "Why not?" She just shook her head. "Bad things happen around it. I'd leave it alone if I were you." I gave a non-committal nod, chalking it up to superstition. Little did I know how right she was. Back home, I hung the painting in my modest living room. I couldn't explain it, but the image spoke to me. There was a sense of desolation in that field, in the figure's posture, like a snapshot of utter hopelessness. As soon as the frame was on my wall, an uneasy atmosphere seemed to settle over the house. It was subtle at first. That night, I dreamed of the field in the painting. I saw the figure more clearly, a tall, gaunt man with empty eyes. He stared at me from across the field, his jaw unhinged as though he wanted to scream but couldn't. When I woke up, my heart was thundering. I was drenched in sweat. The next day, I examined the painting again, thinking maybe there was a signature or date. The only marking on the back was a small smear of red paint. Whether it was art supply or something else, I couldn't tell. I shrugged it off and went about my day. But the odd occurrences persisted. The house grew colder, even when the thermostat read 72 degrees. Sometimes I heard faint rustling noises, like footsteps across a carpet. Once I caught a glimpse of movement reflected in the TV screen. Someone tall and thin passing behind me. When I spun around, the room was empty. I tried ignoring it, but each night the dreams got worse. The figure was always closer, his face twisting in silent rage. Sometimes his hands would reach out for me, elongated fingers grasping. I'd wake with a choked gasp, my heart pounding. Work suffered because I was too distracted, too tired. My phone calls to clients were peppered with stutters and half-finished sentences. That Saturday, 1 week after I'd bought the painting, I decided enough was enough. I'd try to return it to the old woman's house. The trip ended up being fruitless. The house was empty, with a real estate sign hammered into the lawn. Even the phone number on the sign was disconnected. It was like she'd vanished. I thought about just tossing the painting in a dumpster, but something told me that wouldn't help. Late that night, I was awakened by a strange tapping sound. Tap, 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 coming from the living room. I crept out of bed, gripping a flashlight. My living room was bathed in the dim glow of a streetlight outside, and in that pale illumination, I saw the painting's figure was different. The silhouette in the field no longer stood tall. Instead, it appeared to be leaning forward, closer to the frame's edge, as if reaching out. My mind reeled. Was I seeing things? Suddenly, the painting's glass rattled. Something inside it banged against the glass from the inside. That was the tapping. 7A scream lodged in my throat. Then a crack splintered across the glass. I watched, horror mounting, as a long skeletal hand pushed through. An impossible hand, all black and dripping with something like ink. The paint was sloughing off, revealing an inky darkness beneath it, a swirling void behind the frame. The figure's head emerged, a gaunt face with hollow eyes, its jaw stretched open in a silent moan. I couldn't move. The cold that radiated from that thing was paralyzing. Then it reached for me. Its bony fingers curled around the edge of the frame, and I felt a blast of frigid air. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest heavy object, an iron fireplace poker, and hurled it at the painting. The glass shattered, and the figure recoiled with an unearthly hiss. The swirling darkness began to shrink, like water draining from a tub, and the figure was pulled back inside. The painting's wooden frame cracked and splintered, releasing a burst of cold wind that knocked me off my feet. Then, in an instant, it was over. 8. A heavy silence followed. The painting lay in pieces, the field and figure gone, replaced by a torn canvas that looked decades, if not centuries, old. I gathered the fragments in trembling hands. The red smear on the back glistened like fresh blood. I wasted no time. I stuffed the entire ruin of canvas and frame into a garbage bag and drove it far out of town to a landfill, discarding it in a pit of trash. I never saw the old woman again, nor did I ever dream of that barren field. I replaced the living room decor, repainted the walls, and installed brighter lights. Yet sometimes, late at night, I wake up and see a shadow shaped like that figure outside my window, flickering in the street lamp glow. I remind myself it's just my imagination, but I can't help thinking, did I truly destroy the painting or just set it free? After a tough week dealing with auto insurance claims, I decided to hit up some garage sales in the suburbs. Like usual, I cruised around until I spotted a sign nailed to a telephone pole. Multi-family garage sale, Dead End Street. Following the hand-drawn arrow, I found a small cluster of houses with items strewn across their driveways. I liked searching for unusual finds, things with character. That's when I saw the doll. It was propped on a child's chair, porcelain face, glass eyes, curly hair. She wore a frilly pink dress, and in her tiny hand, she clutched a little mirror that was badly cracked. The effect was eerie. A woman in her 40s stood nearby, fidgeting anxiously. When I showed interest in the doll, she practically shoved it at me. "Please, take it for $1, she said. "I just want it gone." Her desperation should have been a warning sign, but I'd always liked vintage dolls. This one, though chipped and cracked, had an oddly compelling quality, like it was beckoning me. $1 was nothing, so I scooped it up, ignoring the gnawing sense of unease. The woman mumbled something as I left. "Careful with that mirror," but I pretended not to hear. Back at my house, I placed the doll on a shelf in my home office, mostly as a decoration. Its curly hair needed tidying, so I gave it a quick dusting. The cracked mirror in its hand was unusual. The reflection was warped into multiple fractals of glass. It gave me goosebumps. That night, I was working late when the overhead light began to flicker. I tapped the switch, thinking it was a loose connection, then froze. The mirror in the doll's hand seemed to catch the light. In its fractured surface, I glimpsed something moving behind me, a shadow. When I spun around, the room was empty. The flickering stopped, but my pulse continued to race. I forced myself to ignore the sensation and went to bed. Hours later, I woke up to the sound of a distant giggle. It wasn't a childlike giggle, though. It was throaty, low, as if mimicking a child. I sat up, heart hammering, listening, then silence. Over the next few days, weird occurrences multiplied. My reflection in bathroom mirrors seemed off, delayed by a split second. In the living room mirror, I sometimes caught the flicker of something standing behind me, a woman with hollow eyes, wearing that same pink dress as the doll, always gone when I whipped my head around. Worse, the doll itself appeared to change positions on its shelf. One morning, its head was tilted to the side, eyes angled downward. Another afternoon, its arms were in a slightly different pose. I tried rationalizing. Maybe I'd knocked it accidentally. But deep down, I knew better. Late one night, I was jolted awake by glass shattering. Sprinting to my office, I found the doll on the floor, the cracked mirror in pieces around her porcelain feet. Her expression, though unchanging, seemed smug. The shards of the mirror lay scattered. Reflected in those shards, I saw 1,000 tiny versions of my own terrified face, and behind me, a tall figure with curls of hair that seemed to swirl like smoke. I spun around, but there was no one. Shaken, I carefully swept up the broken glass and placed it in a box. I considered throwing the entire doll in the trash, but a strange reluctance held me back. Some part of me worried that if I did, it might only make things worse. That night, the giggling returned. It echoed through the dark hallways, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Doors creaked open, closed themselves, and the air felt dense. I locked myself in the bedroom, but the giggling followed me, rising to a shrill pitch. In the mirror above my dresser, my reflection flickered, and for an instant I wasn't looking at myself. I was looking at the porcelain doll's face, her glass eyes blazing with something like triumph. I screamed, flailing backward onto the bed. The reflection snapped back to normal. Morning found me exhausted, nerves frayed to the breaking point. I dug up the phone number from the yard sale listing online, tracking down the woman who sold me the doll. She answered with a shaky voice, confirming my worst fears. She'd inherited the doll from an aunt who warned that the mirror was cursed. Supposedly, it trapped a restless spirit, one that yearned to escape by latching onto a living host. I dropped the phone, adrenaline surging. That explained the reflection weirdness, the sense that something was always standing behind me. My mind raced. If a spirit was attached to the mirror, maybe destroying it was the key. But I'd already broken the mirror. Had that released whatever was inside? I had to act. Gathering every mirror in my house, I took them to the garage, smashing them into bits, not caring about the superstition of 7 years' bad luck. I was done playing around. Then I retrieved the doll. Even though the mirror was gone, I felt the doll was the anchor, the original vessel. I placed the doll on the cold concrete floor, grabbed a hammer, and hesitated. An icy fear told me if I smashed it, I could make things worse. The doll's face seemed to stare at me, almost daring me to act. My hands shook as I lifted the hammer. A knock at the garage door froze me in place. I turned, half expecting to see a neighbor, but the door was open and no one was there. Another giggle echoed. Summoning my courage, I brought the hammer down with all my might, shattering the porcelain skull into shards. A wind-like gust roared through the garage, extinguishing the overhead light. In the darkness, I heard a keening wail, high and piercing, as if the spirit inside had been torn apart. The windows rattled, my ears rang. And then, silence. The overhead light flickered back to life. The doll was in pieces, the once cracked mirror already long gone, and I felt an eerie emptiness in the garage. I swept up every fragment, sealed them in a trash bag, and dumped them in a landfill miles away. After that day, the giggling stopped, and reflections no longer moved on their own. I could finally sleep without hearing footsteps in the hall. Yet sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I see a pink blur, a swirl of curls, and I wonder, does that spirit linger, searching for another mirror, another doll, another unwitting soul? Few things excite me like the possibility of stumbling upon hidden treasure at a garage sale, a vintage clock that still ticks, an old camera with half-finished film, or sometimes even a locked box that begs to be opened. But the day I found the yard key was the day my innocent weekend ritual turned into a nightmare. It was a sweltering morning in mid-July, and I was scanning through tables of random clutter, rusted wrenches, chipped mugs, a half-broken radio, when I spotted an antique skeleton key hanging from a piece of twine. It was large, iron, and had ornate filigree at the bow. Something about it whispered, "Buy me?" The woman conducting the sale was busy with other customers, so I simply asked, "How much?" She glanced over, eyebrows knitting together. "That old thing?" $1, I thanked her, dropped $1 into her money box, and slipped the key off its twine. Oddly, as soon as I held it, a jolt ran through my hand, like static electricity, only sharper. I told myself it was the summer heat. Back home, I set the key on my kitchen counter, planning to display it as decor, maybe hang it on the wall as a quirky antique. But that evening, as I flipped on the TV, a weird sense of restlessness overcame me. My gaze kept drifting to the key. I decided to examine it more closely. Intricate swirls and notches lined the shaft, and the teeth were jagged in a way that almost seemed random. There was a small inscription near the bow, too faded to read. Trying to rub it clean, I pricked my thumb on a sharp edge. A tiny bead of blood welled up. Something strange happened then. A faint hissing sound, like air escaping. It came from the key. Startled, I dropped it on the coffee table. The hiss stopped. The lights flickered momentarily. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to exhaustion. That night, I had a vivid nightmare. I was standing in a mist-filled cemetery at night, holding the key. There was a gate in front of me, locked with a massive padlock shaped like a snarling face. In the distance, a figure moaned, dragging what looked like chains behind it. I remember the overwhelming sense of dread, the feeling that if I opened that gate, something unspeakable would be unleashed. Over the next few days, odd occurrences piled up. My front door would be found ajar in the morning, though I was certain I'd locked it. I'd wake at exactly 3:14 a.m. for no apparent reason. The TV switched channels by itself, always landing on old black and white horror movies. The key itself appeared in random spots around the house. I'd leave it on the coffee table, only to find it later on the windowsill. Once I found it on my pillow after I'd left it in the kitchen. Convinced I was just misplacing it, I resolved to lock it away. I stuffed it in a small wooden box in my closet, latched the box, and tried to forget about it. That night, my phone buzzed at 3:14 a.m. with a text from an unknown number. "Let me out," it read. My blood ran cold. I dialed the number back, no connection. Heart pounding, I went to check the box where I'd locked the key. The latch was undone, the box empty, but the closet door was locked from the inside. Panicked, I rattled the knob until it gave way. Inside, the key lay on the floor, upright as if someone had placed it there. A sudden gust of wind slammed the window open, even though it was already closed. It was as if the house itself was resisting me. I remember feeling a presence, as though someone or something hovered in the corner. My breath turned to mist, as if the temperature had plummeted. The nightmares worsened. Every time I saw that gate with the monstrous padlock, I always held the skeleton key, struggling not to turn it in the lock, while a voice hissed, "Open it!" The figure in chains drew closer each dream. half-rotted hands reaching out. Desperate for answers, I revisited the yard sale location. The house was vacant, a foreclosure sign posted in the window. Neighbors said the owner had moved abruptly and left no forwarding address. I was alone with my curse. Returning home, I found the key resting in the middle of my kitchen floor. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. My phone chimed again. Open it, from the same unknown number. Fear twisted my stomach. Then came the final straw. I woke around 3 a.m. to a scraping sound in the hallway. Candlelight flickered under my bedroom door, except I hadn't lit any candles. Easing the door open, I found dozens of melted candles arranged in a circle around the key. The flames danced, revealing shadowy shapes on the walls. I heard chanting, or maybe whispering, although I could see no one. My knees threatened to buckle. This was beyond a bad dream. Something was orchestrating it. Something wanted me to use that key. I had to end it. Snatching a dish towel, I carefully picked up the key from the circle, the candle flames guttering out as I did. The house fell silent, but the air was charged, as if anticipating my next move. In a frenzy, I drove to the outskirts of town, where there was a small, overgrown cemetery. I'd never been there before, but some instinct guided me. The gate squeaked as I entered. My flashlight cut a weak beam through the tombstones. Heart in my throat, I followed a narrow path until I found a tall iron fence enclosed by a battered gate. The padlock was enormous, grotesquely shaped like a screaming face. Trembling, I pulled out the skeleton key. It glided into the lock perfectly. The moment it clicked, the night seemed to breathe. 100 shadows flitted among the headstones. A keening wail echoed from the darkness. I recognized the chain-dragging figure from my nightmares, only now it was real, shambling toward me with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in agony. Before I could turn the key fully, I realized what horror I was about to unleash. Summoning every ounce of will, I yanked the key out of the lock. The figure shrieked, lunging for the gate, bony arms reaching between the bars. With a burst of adrenaline, I sprinted from the cemetery, the key clutched tight. I didn't stop until I was miles away. The sun started to rise. Breathing heavily, I knew what I had to do. Destroy the key, or bury it someplace it could never be found. I remembered a foundry on the far side of town where they did metalwork. I bribed a worker with $100 to let me toss something into the smelting furnace. He didn't ask questions. I watched the key melt into a blob of molten iron, hissing and smoking. As it dissolved, I felt a weight lift from my soul. I drove home, exhausted but relieved. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. Though I've rid myself of that cursed key, I'll never forget the moment it nearly opened something unspeakable. If I'd turned that lock, what might have emerged? Even now, I catch myself checking that the foundry is still running, the furnace still lit, afraid that somehow the key could reform, afraid that if it does, I won't be there to stop whoever tries to use it next. I've always been a collector of curiosities, old postcards, tarnished spoons, antique trinkets that nobody else wants. My friends joke that if I see a yard sale sign, I practically skid my tires to turn. It was on a crisp autumn morning that I stumbled upon a large community sale in the park. Tables stretched across the grass, offering everything from vintage jewelry to used power tools. A small booth at the far edge caught my attention. It was decorated with lace doilies and dusty figurines. Behind the table stood a petite elderly woman with a knitted shawl wrapped around her shoulders. On the table was a wooden music box, intricately carved with swirling patterns and inlaid mother of pearl. Despite my fascination with trinkets, I normally avoided music boxes, too fragile, but this one was calling to me. "How much?" I asked, drawn to its delicate craftsmanship. She gave me a sad smile. $10. I lifted the lid carefully. The interior was lined with red velvet, but the winding mechanism was missing. Does it play? The woman shook her head. It's silent now, but perhaps you can make it sing again, she whispered. Her tone was cryptic, but I chalked it up to her being poetic. I paid her, thanked her, and placed the music box in my bag. As I walked away, she called after me. Beware what you let inside. The words sent a shiver up my spine. At home, I set the music box on my coffee table to admire it. It was a masterpiece of woodcraft, even if it no longer played. Idly, I tried to wind it, but there was no key or spring inside. I decided I'd take it to a repair shop in town. Maybe it could be restored. That night, I dreamt of the box. In my dream, it was open, and the gentle tinkle of a lullaby filled the air. Except there was a discordant note, too, a low hum that didn't belong. A voice joined in, humming along eerily. When I woke, the melody clung to my ears, though I couldn't recall the exact tune. The next day, after a dull shift dealing with insurance claims, I headed to a local antique repair shop. The owner, Mr. Delgado, examined the music box with fascination. He told me it was older than it looked, probably late 19th century. The spring was missing, but the gear system was intact. Oddly, there were markings inside the wood that he couldn't decipher, some script that looked vaguely like runes or archaic symbols. He offered to try a custom fit for a new winding mechanism. Might take a week or two, he said. I agreed, leaving the box with him. 3 nights later, I got an urgent call from Mr. Delgado. He sounded shaken. You need to come get this box, he said, his voice trembling. I can't keep it in my shop anymore. Puzzled, I asked him what was wrong, but he just repeated, Come get it, please, before hanging up. When I arrived, I found him pacing behind his counter, eyes bloodshot. He thrust the music box into my hands. It started playing on its own. I hadn't even installed the new mechanism. Then there were voices, whispers. I swear I heard them calling my name, he said. Unnerved, I took the box and apologized. He shook his head, refusing to accept payment for his partial work. I left, the music box feeling heavier in my arms than before. Back home, I placed the box on my dining table, uncertain what to do next. I sat, staring at its ornate carvings, the swirl of mother of pearl. I recalled the old woman's warning. Beware what you let inside. Could it be that this box was something more than just an antique? Suddenly, the silence was broken by a faint tinkling sound. My breath caught. Slowly, the lid rose on its own, and the music began, a slow, haunting lullaby. The gears inside spun, though there was no mechanism. My reflection in the mother of pearl danced in the flickering overhead light. And then came the whispering, a dozen voices, layered, singing a wordless chant that sent icy dread through my veins. The hair on my arms stood on end. I mustered the courage to slam the lid shut, cutting off the music. The whispering died instantly. My heart thundered in my chest. For a moment, I debated throwing the box in the fireplace, but I couldn't risk burning my house down. Also, part of me feared that destroying it might unleash whatever lurked inside. I placed the box in a plastic bin with a heavy lid, hoping that might contain any further activity. Sleep was nearly impossible. I kept expecting to hear that lullaby or the voices creeping through the walls. The next morning, I discovered muddy footprints leading from my front door to the bin. The door was locked, the windows latched. Yet the footprints were unmistakable. Small, childlike footprints. My stomach knotted. Lifting the bin's lid, I found the music box open again, the velvet interior damp as if touched by wet hands. Furious and terrified, I phoned the local historical society, hoping for a clue. They referred me to an expert in folklore. Dr. Reyes, a soft-spoken researcher, examined the photos I sent of the runic inscriptions. These symbols are rumored to be used in certain old world rituals, she said. Some believed they could trap souls or spirits within an object. The spirit remained silent until someone tried to restore the object's function, like winding a music box. My mind whirled. Could Mr. Delgado's attempt to fix the music box have awakened something? Dr. Reyes explained that if a trapped spirit was malevolent, it might attempt to lure victims into opening a gateway. Objects like these, she said, can feed off attention and fear. Best course of action is to bury it in hallowed ground or consecrate it, anything to sever its tie to our world. Without hesitation, I turned off my phone and hurried to pack the music box in a sealed container. Dr. Reyes had given me directions to an old deconsecrated church outside town. The ground, while once holy, was said to be avoided by locals after a series of strange incidents. She believed it might still carry enough lingering power to suppress malevolent energies. I drove at dusk, the setting sun painting the sky blood red. Parking outside the abandoned church, I forced open the rusty gate and slipped inside the overgrown courtyard. Weeds and vines strangled old tombstones. The place felt saturated with gloom, but it was the best lid I had. I dug a shallow hole near a crumbling headstone. With each shovel thrust, the wind picked up, howling through broken stained glass windows. As I lowered the sealed container, the music started again, even though it was locked away. The lullaby bled through the plastic, wavering in the night air. I heard faint wails, sobs, and frantic whispers. A part of me pitied whatever was trapped inside, but fear overruled sympathy. I shoved dirt over the container, packing it tight. The music grew faint. Finally, it stopped. The wind died down, leaving only silence. I exhaled, relief flooding me. I mouthed a quiet apology to whatever I'd sealed in the earth, then turned and left. In the weeks that followed, my nightmares subsided. The childlike footprints no longer appeared. I could sleep again without hearing lullabies in the dark. But I've quit hunting for antiques at yard sales. Something about hidden gems has lost its allure. Occasionally, I dream of that old music box, half buried in the churchyard soil, its lid pried open, the lullaby echoing beneath the ground. In these dreams, the voices chant in a mournful dirge, as if waiting for some curious wanderer to dig it up again and set them free